Hey there, PhD friends, and welcome to another video. In today's video, I'm interviewing Dr. Nick Edwards, who has a PhD in neuroscience, and he's worked primarily in the life sciences space. But specifically, I interviewed him for his management consulting experience. Perhaps you've heard about management consulting as a non-academic career path that you could pursue as a PhD. We talk about that. And I encourage you to watch this video to the end because towards the end there, Nick drops some very special wisdom nuggets about building a career that fits your life and not necessarily building your life around your career. And let me tell you, that's something that took me over 30 years to realize, and for some people it even takes them their whole lives to realize that they've been building their whole life around their career and not the other way around. And I think it's such an important question to consider as you build your career. All right, before we get into the interview, I want to tell you about this free resource that I created: 34 non-academic career paths that you could pursue as a PhD. You can download it at this link right here. Right, it's free. Now let's get into the interview. Hi, Nick. I'm so excited to have you on the Bold PhD. Like I always ask all my guests, tell us a little bit about your educational background.
Hi, Gertrude. All right. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me on. And yeah, my educational background, I am a neuroscientist by training. So I did a PhD and a postdoc in neuro. My PhD was at Brown University. It's this joint program between Brown and the NIH. And I worked on the circuitry of addiction and looking at different receptors that were involved in addictive processes. I then went on to do a postdoc at UC San Diego, where I live now in San Diego, and more on working on, still in animal models, but working on the circuits involved in attention or alertness in mice, and kind of auditory perception. So full on neuroscientist by training, but like before that, in college, I did my undergrad in neuroscience as well, but I went like up to my senior year as an English literature major, and then switched at the very end, and then jumped straight into neuroscience. And so have a little bit of humanities background as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. What made you make that jump?
Well, I did. It was a pretty big jump. I did a law internship for a district attorney's office because I was like, what am I going to do with an English literature major? I was, thinking about academia, but I did this internship, and it was a kind of a crazy case. It was a murder case, and it wasn't really that. It was more just like I realized it didn't really fit my personality. Like the minutia of it wasn't for me. And so I started looking around, and I hadn't done well like in my freshman year in college chemistry. I got like a C plus, and I was like, I don't know if I want to do science, but that's why I went into English. And then I came back and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to try this again. And I took the next class in chemistry, and I like just studied like crazy, and did really well. And I started to like get interested in science, and do really well in classes, and I found that actually it suited me pretty well. I just realized that like I needed to put in more work than I thought I had to when I first started college.
No, thank you for sharing that story with us. It's always so enlightening when I'm having these conversations with people to learn what that educational trajectory was like for them, because it's never straightforward, right? You would think that somebody who started with an English major will end up in some related profession, or they carry that through. But I think this is a good lesson in the fact that, education can be dynamic and fluid, and, not to kind of limit yourself to one field per se, right? And so, yeah, thank you for sharing that so much with us. And so from there, you got your PhD in neuroscience. And then what did you venture into?
Yeah, so I did the postdoc for a little while, and things were going well. I was actually planning on becoming an academic professor, and I think that things were kind of going down that track pretty well. But I was living in San Diego, and I like San Diego. I wanted to figure out a way to be able to stay here and still do something that I was excited about, and also make a difference in patients' lives. And so I started to think about what different options were, and I kind of planned out this long-term trajectory of figuring out a way to mix business and science. Um, and so since I'd had the scientific background, I figured, okay, well, where can I go get some business training? Um, there's MBA programs, of course, if people want to do that. But the path that I chose to do was to go into management consulting. And so I went and worked at Boston Consulting Group for a while, BCG, and then since then have so we could talk a little bit about consulting if you'd like, but since then have worked across a number of different companies and functional areas. So from consulting, I spent some time at Illumina, working in their commercial strategy group, and just really awesome experience. It's here in San Diego, um, and then have been at startups since Illumina. Helps build the research arm of a really high growth startup here in the area, and then also have worked in company creation, like venture creation for what we call a venture studio, helping to start companies from the very beginning, and both like helping them strategically, but also like operationally helping them to like co-found and get these things really off the ground.
Amazing. And so you really, jumped into that, melding the business and science. You really have done that with the whole experience trajectory or experience journey you just described. I think one of the things that really intrigued me about, and first of all, let's also acknowledge that you were with BCG and Illumina. That's pretty huge. Okay, so I just want to acknowledge that. For those of you that are not in the biotech world or in the biotech space, BCG is a big consulting company and Illumina is a huge biotech company. And then you've been at high growth startups. So this is really exciting to talk to somebody like you. I think one of the things that really intrigued me about your experiences, Nick, was consulting, right? One of the things that we do here at the Bull PhD is really point people on different non-academic career paths. And like you said, you thought you were going on that academic path. It seemed like it was going well. But then I think the thing that you were saying but didn't finish saying was San Diego is super expensive. Because I live in San Diego too, and San Diego is really expensive, and in order to survive, I'm telling you, like Professor Sari is not gonna cut it out here. And so maybe that was a little bit of it. And I know that people have different motivations for moving out of academia, not necessarily always financial. But I know that because we do that, because we talk around, these are different career paths you can go. And I'm really intrigued to learn about how you got into consulting and what consulting actually is, because people throw that word around and it can be confusing as to what it is.
Sure. Yeah. So let me put in a plug real quick, actually, because I did I have a podcast called Once a Scientist, and
Yep.
I've been doing that for a couple years, and the only reason why I'm plugging it is because I did a 5-part series with Harvard and MIT on like what consulting is, how to do a resume and a cover letter, how to go through the interview process, and so probably the easiest way to find it is on my website that I no longer own somehow, but it's still
I
there.
don't worry. I'll find your podcast and
It's
put it in here so people will find.
yeah. Yeah, it's called oncethescientist.net, but there's a consulting 101 series, and you can check that out. But in terms of like the decision making process to go in and do that and how I learned about it, I had heard about it in grad school, but I didn't really know what it was. And there were periods in grad school where I was like, I don't know if I can keep doing this, because like I was just kind of beating my head against the wall and nothing was working for a few years really. And then things like started to snowball and actually worked out really well by the end. So I got into a postdoc, and the way that it came about was actually I was surfing with a friend, and we were talking, and he was, going down a business management track, and he was like, "Well, have you ever thought about consulting?" I was like, Not really." Like, well, they hire a lot of PhDs, and so I looked into it, and I found out that UC San Diego had a consulting club, and I went to one of these consulting club events, and what it was that they had a case competition. So one of the life sciences firms, LEK, had this competition, and I joined up, and I joined with a group of other PhD students, and they give you a problem, a business problem, like, you know the company's trying to look to go move into a new market, and want to figure out, like, what's the competitive landscape look like, and you know what type of product should they be building, for example. I volunteered for this, and I realized through the process that, like, this is actually pretty interesting. It's solving high level problems for businesses, and they're kind of like defined amounts of time working on in each individual case, and you work with a team to you develop a hypothesis, you test those hypotheses with data, and then you present your results, you present your findings to the client, and give them a strategic recommendation on, like, what's the path forward that they should move into. And so that's the general idea behind consulting, and that's what that was like the exposure I got as a postdoc. And so I was like, okay, this seems pretty cool, pretty interesting. And so I started just finding people that were practicing getting prepared to go into these consulting firms, because I'm not going to lie, like, it's very, very competitive to get into these positions. People practice sometimes hundreds of hours to do case interviews, and to be able to tell their story of why they want to go into consulting. So I went online, and I found some forums where people wanted to practice, whether they were like PhD students or whether they're MBAs or whatever it was. And I found people that, like, wanted to do it consistently. And so I approached my PI at the time, and I was like, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing something else." He was very supportive, and so I have to give him credit for that. And so I kept doing lab work in the daytime, but I spent probably like 40 hours a week for at least 2 or 3 weeks, just practicing and preparing, on top of the lab work. And then I started going into consulting interviews with various different firms, and was able to land a position. So I think there's that aspect of it, but also just talking to a lot of people that had done it, or that were planning on doing it, and trying to understand their motivations and what they were excited about, because it's networking, right? But it's really just like data gathering, trying to figure out, like, what different people's experiences are like, and then develop hypotheses and conclusions. So I really view the whole process as both the process of consulting and the process of getting into consulting as like a scientific process of really kind of like refining a hypothesis.
Right. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. Because the question I was going to ask earlier on when you started explaining was, well, you're a scientist, and then you have to start thinking like a business person. But I love that towards the end there, you said you treat it like an experiment, right? There's a hypothesis, and then you come up with the experiment that will try to answer that hypothesis, and then you have results, right? And then those results determine if your hypothesis was true or not. So thank you for sharing that with us. And so for somebody that may want to get into consulting, do they have to, know a lot about business? Do they have to have a lot of business acumen? How did you bridge that gap?
Well, I sure as hell didn't know a lot about business, but I knew some, because I had worked in college to kind of pay my way through college at a couple startups. So that helped a little bit. But really, the business acumen that you need to know to be able to get into consulting from science there is a kind of like an activation energy barrier that you have to get over, and yeah, you do have to put in some work. Just to understand general frameworks of how people think about solving business problems. And and obviously there's like calculations, like financial calculations that are not difficult for a PhD. Like it's pretty simple math, but it's being able to deal with like large numbers, like, like million, like being able to multiply, millions of things and thousands of things, and like being able to keep track of that in your head. So like there's a bit of like math preparation. But the business background, I think, can be fairly like learned fairly quickly to a degree where you're proficient enough to solve a case for a consulting interview, because these firms, they don't they expect you to have scientific like expertise. That's what you've been doing, and they know when they are interviewing you that you're a scientist. They do expect you to have like at least some background knowledge, and preferably you would have had some sort of business experience, whether it's like volunteering through a consulting club, or like maybe some people do venture capital internships, or there's you can volunteer, get involved in almost anything to gain relevant experience. But I think there is a certain level of baseline knowledge that you need to have. But when you compare it to like getting ready for your like qualifying exams in a PhD, it's like it's nothing.
It's
It's like,
nothing. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, because I think sometimes, again, we can get in our own heads about how much knowledge do I need to actually do this. But so thank you for being super encouraging about that. Are there any specific, so apart from the forums that you said you had been a part of, the practice that that you did on your own with other people, are there specific resources that you may recommend? It's okay if you don't have specific resources, maybe books, or is there anything like that? And magazines. I know one time when I went, this is way back when I was considering consulting as one of my career paths. I know one of the things that somebody had suggested was to try to read about the industry, I guess, like get into trade magazines and find out what's
yeah,
going on, right?
yeah, yeah. I think that's a good idea. There's a few websites. I think I do think it's useful to follow some sort of like to read some sort of business journals. So if you're interested in like general business, politics aside, like Wall Street Journal's not a bad place to look for understanding getting some business acumen. The Economist, I think, is a really interesting one. And when you're reading those types of things, like the way that I approached it, and had someone explain to me one time when I was at BCG, which I thought was really good, is like you read this long article, and basically what you're trying to be able to do is like explain in like 3 to 4 bullet points what that article was talking about, and kind of synthesize that information. So I think that's like one way to get some general business acumen. If you're looking to be in the life sciences, which I imagine probably a decent number of your listeners are interested in, there's a few websites that I think are pretty worthwhile. Fierce Biotech is one. Stat News is another one, and Endpoints is the third. So I think Stat and Endpoints have a paywall. I don't think Fierce Biotech does, but you can get free articles, I think, on all of them as well.
Yeah.
Those are really good places to start to get some like general like understanding of how the biotech industry works.
Mm-hmm. No, those are super helpful. Yeah, Stat News. I know I've not really been into endpoints, but I know Stat News does have a paywall. But even then, the free articles they do have on Stat News are super helpful. And so, you may not necessarily have to pay for it. But if you find, you want to get deeper into some stories, and they do have some, I feel like the most of the things behind the paywall are, I keep on hitting my mic, data heavy. data heavy articles. And so if you wanted to really get into the data, that's when, paying them makes a lot of sense for their business model. Yeah. Thank you so much.
One other resource I would recommend that was really helpful for me when I was preparing for consulting was there's a guy named Victor Cheng, Cheng, I think. And a number of years ago, he put out a bunch of resources for getting into consulting. I don't remember what his website is called, but people can Google it. And he had this series called "Look Over My Shoulder." It was an audio recording, and he would do case interviews with people. He was a former McKinsey consultant, and then he would like interject and debrief like in the middle and say like, okay, here's what this person did well here, or here's what this person could have done better at. And then like at the end, there was like a full on debrief of the case. And he does that like for 8 to like maybe 10 interviews or something like that. And I listened to that over and over as I was doing experiments in the lab because, as we all know, like there are kind of some mindless experiments that like by the time you're pretty good at doing what you do in science, like it can be pretty routine to do some of those. And so I would listen to that on repeat, and it helped me to like think about things in a way that a consultant would think, but also like give actual like phrases and things that you might say in a case interview. To frame things in the right way. So I think that's a good resource. It does cost money also, but I think that one, if you're really serious into getting into consulting, it's a worthwhile investment.
Absolutely. That's really, really helpful. Thank you, Nick. I mean, this is like gold that you're pouring out there for people that want to get into consulting. So this conversation has been great. If people want to reach out to you, so I want to mention again, I want to plug Once Upon a Scientist, or Once a Scientist, not Once Upon, or Once a Scientist. That's Nick's podcast for you to go listen, because I know that he does interview a lot of PhDs as well, a lot of academics that are doing various things. And so that's a good podcast to listen to in general. And then his Consulting 101 series is also going to be valuable to you if you want to get into consulting. Any parting words of wisdom, Nick?
Yeah. I've talked to a lot of people about like you. I've talked to a lot of people about different paths. I think there's I'll say a couple things. One, it's really worthwhile to be very introspective about a career search, thinking long term. Like what are the things that I like really care about? Not just the things that I've been doing or the things that I have expertise in, but like what do I want out of life? And like build your career around that, because the alternative is to build your life around your career. And while that may work for a lot of people, I think that it leads to like people being jaded sometimes later on in life. If so really trying to like dig at the heart of like what you care about, what your personality type is like, and what types of things would fit with you, I think is important. Another thing I would say is that if you're listening to this podcast or YouTube series,
Yeah.
maybe both.
Well, actually, I just found out that YouTube now has a podcast tab on YouTube. So it is a podcast. It's just a video podcast. So let's just call it that.
Okay, cool. So I imagine most of the people that are listening to this, what was I going to say, have pretty extensive educations and have spent a decent amount of time gaining expertise. And when you do that, this, at least my own experience, is that a lot of times you're working with very smart, very qualified people and high caliber people, and it's really easy to compare yourself against other people. And while I think it's always good to be around people that are smarter or like just, just interesting in general, it can take a hit to your self-esteem. Plus also, um, you spend so many years facing like the edge of the unknown in science, and just not really knowing, like you're taking steps into the darkness, and that's kind of scary, and sometimes you get a little bit lost, I think, in a way, and so people's confidence drops, and so I would say, uh, try not to let that happen, because and try to realize like the strengths and the accomplishments that you already have, because when people are always self-critical, but the but we often discount the ways in which we stand out, and the ways in which like the strengths that we have. And so I would recommend anybody that's listening to this to find ways to build up that confidence again, if you've lost it, because you are smart, and you are accomplished already, and you will continue to do that, as long as you put in the effort, and continue to surround yourself with other interesting, smart, ambitious people.
So many wise takeaways from what you just said. I think that the biggest thing for me was self-introspect and make sure that you are building a career that you want. Otherwise, you end up building careers that other people want or other people expect you to build. And that only leads to frustration. That only leads to, I always talk about, I remember when I was in my postdoc driving into a parking lot for my job at UCSD and breaking down in tears because I didn't want to be there, and you don't want to get to that point. It was a great job. I had a great PI, I had a supportive PI, I had a good lab, but I didn't want to be there. And up until that point, it was at that point that I realized that most of my life I had done things because everybody said that was the path to go on. And that was my own lack of introspection to say, well, this is the path I don't want to be on this path. And if you don't do that, you're going to be really frustrated and think that, oh, the whole thing is a mess. It's a farce. But no, you can work, you can get paid well, and you can enjoy your work. And thank you, Nick, for sharing that with us. I really appreciate
Absolutely.
you. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to chat. It's fun.
Always, always.